The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering behind the iron gates. Among them stood Guard Michael Thompson, his red uniform pressed to perfection, his tall black hat adding to his already impressive height. He had been doing this job for 3 years now, and the routine had become second nature to him. Stand perfectly still. Don't react to anything. Don't move a muscle. These were the golden rules that every Queen's Guard learned on their first day. Michael had mastered this art so well that tourists often wondered if he was even real. Children would wave frantically at him, adults would try to make funny faces, and some people would even tell jokes right in front of him, hoping to catch even the smallest smile. But Michael remained like a statue, his eyes fixed straight ahead. This wasn't just about looking impressive for the cameras. This was about honor, tradition, and representing something much bigger than himself. Every guard understood that they were living symbols of the monarchy, and with that came great responsibility. The crowd was getting bigger as the morning went on. Tour groups from different countries were arriving, their guides explaining the history of the palace and the significance of the guards. Michael could hear snippets of conversations in various languages, but he trained himself to focus on his duty rather than the chatter around him. That's when he first noticed her. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, was sitting in a bright blue wheelchair near the front of the crowd. Unlike the other children who were trying to get his attention through silly gestures, this girl was simply watching him with quiet fascination. Her eyes held a kind of wonder that was different from the usual tourist curiosity. She wasn't trying to make him laugh or break his composure. She was just observing, as if she understood that what he was doing was important and special. There was something about her gentle presence that made Michael more aware of her than all the other people combined. The girl's mother stood behind the wheelchair, occasionally bending down to point out different details about the palace or whisper something in her daughter's ear. The family seemed to be taking their time, not rushing through like many tourists did. They appeared to be savoring every moment of their visit. Michael's training had taught him to be aware of everything around him while maintaining his stoic appearance. He could see potential threats, notice unusual behavior, and keep track of the crowd's movements, all while looking completely motionless. But today, his awareness kept drifting back to the girl in the wheelchair. During his 2-hour shift, most tourists would take their photos and move on within minutes. But this family stayed for almost the entire time. The little girl never got bored or restless like other children might. She seemed genuinely interested in what Michael represented and the history he was part of. At one point, a group of teenagers tried to get close to Michael to take selfies while making ridiculous faces. They were laughing loudly and being somewhat disrespectful, treating him more like a theme park attraction than a serving soldier. Michael had dealt with this kind of behavior countless times, and while it sometimes bothered him internally, his exterior never showed it. But he noticed how the little girl's expression changed during this incident. She looked almost protective of him, as if she understood that these teenagers weren't showing proper respect. Her mother noticed her daughter's reaction and gently explained something to her, probably about how different people react to new experiences in different ways. As Michael's shift was coming to an end, he saw the girl's family preparing to leave. Her father was folding up a small blanket they had brought, and her mother was checking their camera to make sure they had captured the memories they wanted. The little girl took one last long look at Michael, and for just a moment their eyes seemed to meet. In that brief instant, Michael felt a connection that went beyond his role as a guard. He saw not just a tourist, but a brave young person who was facing challenges he could only imagine. There was something in her eyes that spoke of strength and courage, qualities that Michael recognized and respected in his fellow soldiers. The family began to move away, the father pushing the wheelchair while the mother walked alongside them. Michael watched them go, feeling an unexpected emotion stirring within him. Throughout his entire career as a guard, he had maintained professional distance from the public. It was necessary for his job and for the dignity of his position. But something about this encounter was different. This little girl hadn't tried to make him break character or treat him like entertainment. She had simply appreciated him for what he represented, and in doing so, had reminded him of the human element behind the uniform. As the next guard arrived to take over the position, Michael finally allowed himself to relax slightly. He walked to the nearby guardhouse, his mind still thinking about the girl and her family. He wondered where they were from, what had brought them to London, and why this visit seemed so meaningful to them. His fellow guards were discussing the usual topics during their break: weekend plans, football matches, and the more challenging tourists they had dealt with that day. But Michael found himself distracted, still thinking about those thoughtful eyes that had watched him with such respect and understanding. He didn't know it yet, but this encounter was just the beginning of something that would change not only his own perspective on his job, but also touch the lives of many people around the world. Sometimes the most significant moments start with the smallest interactions, and sometimes a single look between strangers can plant the seeds of something beautiful. The little girl in the blue wheelchair had no idea that her simple act of respectful observation had already begun to create ripples that would spread far beyond the palace gates, and Michael had no idea that tomorrow would bring an opportunity to show that beneath the formal uniform and stoic exterior, there beat the heart of someone who understood what it meant to be brave in the face of life's challenges. The day was ending, but this story was just beginning. Word travels fast among the Queen's Guard, and by the next morning several of Michael's fellow guards had heard about the incident with the toy soldier. During their morning briefing, the story was shared in hushed tones, with some guards expressing admiration, while others worried about the potential consequences of breaking protocol. Guard David. Chen had been serving for 5 years and had always prided himself on maintaining perfect discipline. But Michael's story made him think differently about some of the interactions he had been having during his own shifts. There was a young boy, maybe 10 years old, who walked past his post every morning on the way to school. This boy had been taking the same route for months, and every single day he would stop in front of David and give him a proper military salute. The child's form wasn't perfect, but his sincerity was unmistakable. He would stand there for a few seconds, holding his salute with obvious pride, before continuing on his way to school. David had noticed this daily ritual, of course. It was impossible to miss such a consistent and heartfelt gesture. But following strict protocol, he had never acknowledged the boy's salute. He had always remained perfectly still, looking straight ahead as if the child wasn't even there. Now, thinking about Michael's act of kindness, David began to question whether his rigid adherence to protocol was really serving the greater good. This little boy was showing genuine respect and admiration. He was learning about honor and service in his own small way. Was it really wrong to acknowledge that? The next morning, when the boy appeared as usual and rendered his careful salute, David made a decision. Very subtly, almost imperceptibly, he returned the salute. It was just a slight movement of his hand, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking closely, but the boy noticed immediately. The child's face transformed with pure joy. His salute became even sharper, his posture even straighter. For the first time in months of this daily routine, the boy felt truly seen and acknowledged. As he walked away toward school, there was a spring in his step that hadn't been there before. Meanwhile, guard Robert Williams had been dealing with his own recurring visitor. An elderly man came to the palace every Tuesday and Thursday, always wearing a military beret and carrying himself with the bearing of someone who had served his country. The man would stand quietly near Robert's post for about 20 minutes, not taking photos or trying to get attention, just watching with the understanding eyes of someone who knew what military service meant. Robert had learned from conversations he overheard that this man was a veteran of the Korean War. He lived alone now, and these visits to see the guards seemed to be one of the highlights of his week. There was something deeply lonely about him, but also something dignified and proud. Inspired by Michael's example, Robert began to find small ways to acknowledge this veteran's presence. When the old man arrived, Robert would make the smallest possible adjustment to his posture, not enough to break protocol, but enough to signal that he saw him and respected what he represented. The change in the elderly veteran was remarkable. He began standing a little taller during his visits, and Robert could see a sense of connection and purpose returning to his eyes. It was as if being acknowledged by an active duty guard had reminded him that his own service still mattered and was still valued. These small acts of recognition were creating a chain reaction throughout the guard unit. Each soldier began to notice the people behind the cameras in ways they never had before. They started to see past the tourist facade and recognize the real human stories that brought people to the palace. Guard Anthony Parker, noticed a young couple who visited every weekend. Through overheard conversations, he learned that they were saving money for their wedding and couldn't afford many entertainment activities. Their weekly visit to watch the changing of the guard had become their regular date, something special they could do together without spending money they didn't have. Anthony began to make their experience more memorable in tiny ways. He would time his movements during the changing ceremony to create better photo opportunities for them. He would position himself so they could get the best angles for their pictures. These were subtle adjustments that enhanced their experience without compromising his duties. The ripple effect was spreading beyond individual interactions. The guards began talking among themselves during breaks about the people they were meeting and the stories they were witnessing. They started to understand that their role wasn't just about ceremony and tradition. It was about being part of people's most treasured memories. A family visiting from Australia had saved for years to make this trip to London. For them, seeing the Queen's Guard was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Guard Stephen Walsh noticed how the parents were trying to explain the significance of the guards to their children, helping them understand the history and tradition they were witnessing. Stephen found ways to make the family's photos more special. He would maintain perfect posture during their picture taking, ensuring they got the formal, dignified images they wanted. But he would also time his subtle movements to create moments of connection that would make their photos unique and meaningful. The transformation wasn't just affecting the visitors, it was changing the guards themselves. They began to feel more connected to their purpose and more aware of the positive impact they could have. Their job stopped feeling like just a duty and started feeling like a privilege. Guard Kevin Murphy had always struggled with the isolation that came with standing perfectly still for hours. But now he began to see his post as a position of honor, where he could touch people's lives in small but meaningful ways. He noticed an immigrant family who had recently moved to Britain and were learning about their new country's traditions. Their visit to the palace was part of understanding their new home. Kevin made sure his presence added to their sense of welcome. Through his dignified bearing and subtle acknowledgments, he helped them feel that they were witnessing something truly special and that they belonged in this moment of British tradition. The guards were discovering that the most powerful aspect of their role wasn't the authority or the ceremony, it was the opportunity to be part of people's stories. Every tourist had a reason for being there, whether it was education, celebration, or simply the desire to connect with something larger than themselves. What started with Michael's simple act of kindness toward a little girl was growing into something much larger. The Queen's Guard was learning that true service meant serving not just the crown, but all the people who looked to them as symbols of honor, tradition, and basic human decency. The next morning brought gray clouds and a light drizzle that made the palace courtyard glisten. Michael arrived for his shift earlier than usual, though he couldn't quite explain why. As he put on his uniform and adjusted his bearskin hat, his thoughts kept drifting back to the little girl from yesterday. During the brief morning meeting, his sergeant mentioned that they were expecting several charity groups throughout the week. One of them was a special organization that brought children with serious illnesses to see famous landmarks in London. The information hit Michael differently than it normally would have. Usually these briefings were just part of the routine, but today he found himself paying closer attention. As tourists began gathering for the day, Michael took his position with the same precision as always. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cool and damp. He scanned the crowd with his trained eyes, noting the usual mix of families, tour groups, and individual visitors taking photos. Then he saw her again. The little girl in the blue wheelchair was back, this time wearing a bright yellow raincoat that made her easy to spot in the crowd. Her parents were with her again, and they seemed just as patient and caring as they had been the day before. But today, Michael noticed something else about the family. They all wore small pins on their jackets that he couldn't quite make out from his position. Throughout his shift, Michael found himself more aware of this family than any of the other visitors. The little girl had brought something with her today, a small toy soldier that she held carefully in her lap. It was dressed in a red uniform remarkably similar to Michael's own, complete with a tiny black hat. The girl would look at her toy soldier, then look up at Michael, as if comparing them. There was something deeply touching about this innocent comparison that made Michael's chest tighten with emotion he had to work hard to suppress. About halfway through his 2-hour shift, something unexpected happened. The little girl was showing her toy soldier to her mother when it slipped from her small hands. The toy fell to the ground and rolled several feet away from her wheelchair, coming to rest just a few yards from where Michael stood at attention. The girl's face immediately showed distress. This wasn't just any toy. It was clearly something very special to her. Her father started to move toward where the soldier had fallen, but the crowd had thickened, and several people were walking around the area where the toy had landed. Michael watched as the little girl strained to see where her precious toy had gone. Her parents were trying to navigate through the crowd of tourists to retrieve it, but people kept moving around, and someone accidentally kicked the toy even further away. This was the moment when everything changed for Michael. For 3 years, he had followed protocol perfectly. Never move unless it's an emergency. Never interact with tourists. Never break character. These rules had been drilled into him so thoroughly that they had become automatic responses. But as he watched this brave little girl's face fill with worry about her lost toy soldier, something deeper than protocol kicked in. This wasn't about rules or regulations anymore. This was about basic human kindness. And Michael realized that sometimes being truly honorable meant making a choice that went beyond the rulebook. The toy soldier had rolled to within just a few feet of Michael's position. He could see it clearly, lying on the wet pavement getting stepped around by oblivious tourists. He looked at the little girl who was now craning her neck trying to spot her lost treasure among all the moving feet. Michael made a decision that would change everything. Very carefully, and with movements so subtle that most people wouldn't even notice, Michael shifted his weight slightly and gently nudged the toy soldier with the toe of his boot. The small figure slid across the smooth pavement, coming to rest right in front of the little girl's wheelchair. The girl's face lit up with pure joy when she saw her toy soldier appear as if by magic right at her feet. Her father quickly bent down to pick it up and placed it back in her hands. She clutched it tightly, then looked up at Michael with an expression of such gratitude and understanding that it took all of his training to maintain his composure. Several tourists had witnessed this small act of kindness, though not all of them realized what had happened. But those who did understand began to see Michael differently. He wasn't just a ceremonial figure. Anymore, he was a real person who had chosen compassion over protocol. The little girl's mother had tears in her eyes as she mouthed the words "thank you" in Michael's direction. She understood the significance of what had just happened. This soldier had risked breaking the rules that governed his job just to help her daughter retrieve something precious. For the rest of his shift, Michael felt different. He had crossed a line that he had never crossed before, and instead of feeling guilty about it, he felt more connected to his purpose than ever. He began to understand that true service wasn't just about following orders. It was about knowing when humanity should take precedence over procedure. The family stayed until the end of Michael's shift, and as they prepared to leave, something beautiful happened. The little girl held up her toy soldier and made it salute Michael, a gesture so pure and heartfelt that several nearby tourists stopped to watch. Michael wanted desperately to return the salute, but he was still on duty. Instead, he did something almost imperceptible. He shifted his stance just slightly, in a way that could be interpreted as a subtle acknowledgement of her gesture. As the family walked away, Michael realized that this small act of kindness had changed something fundamental inside him. He had discovered that the most powerful thing about wearing the uniform wasn't the authority it represented, but the opportunity it provided to make a positive difference in someone's life. What Michael didn't know was that several people in the crowd had captured his gentle act of kindness on their phones. These images and videos would soon begin traveling across social media platforms, carrying with them a message about the power of small gestures and the humanity that exists beneath even the most formal exteriors. The ripple effects of his simple act were already beginning to spread, though it would be some time before Michael would understand the full impact of his decision to choose compassion over protocol. 3 weeks had passed since Michael first helped the little girl retrieve her toy soldier, and the small acts of kindness among the guards had become a quiet but powerful part of their daily routine. But everything was about to change in a way that none of them could have predicted. Michael was preparing for what he thought would be another ordinary shift when his sergeant pulled him aside with some news that hit him like a punch to the stomach. The little girl who had touched his heart, the one with the bright smile and the toy soldier, was named Lucy, and she was part of a special program for children facing terminal illnesses. The charity organization had reached out to the palace because Lucy had been talking non-stop about the kind guard who had helped her. Her condition had taken a turn for the worse, and doctors weren't sure how much time she had left. Her one wish was to see the changing of the guard ceremony one more time. Michael felt his heart sink as he processed this information. This brave little girl who had shown such strength and grace was fighting a battle that no child should ever have to face. The toy soldier she carried wasn't just a plaything. It was a symbol of the courage she was showing every single day. As Michael took his position for the ceremony that day, he could see Lucy's family in the crowd. She was in her wheelchair as always, but today she looked frailer than before. Despite her obvious fatigue, her eyes still held that same wonder and respect that had first caught Michael's attention weeks ago. The changing of the guard ceremony was always precisely choreographed. Every movement was planned, every step was measured, and deviation from the routine was strictly forbidden. Guards were trained to execute the ceremony with mechanical precision, regardless of what was happening around them. But as Michael marched in formation, passing close to where Lucy sat with her family, he made a decision that would change everything. In a moment that seemed to slow down time itself, he turned his head slightly toward Lucy and gave her a proper military salute. It was a break from protocol so significant that it sent ripples through the entire ceremony. The other guards noticed immediately. The tourists gasped in surprise, and dozens of cameras captured the moment. But Michael only cared about one reaction: the pure joy that spread across Lucy's face as she realized that this formal salute was meant specifically for her. Lucy tried to return the salute from her wheelchair, her small hand shaking slightly from the effort, but her determination was absolute. In that moment, she wasn't just a sick child anymore, she was a fellow soldier being honored by someone who recognized her courage. The crowd around them seemed to understand, instinctively, that they were witnessing something special. People who had been chattering and taking casual photos suddenly fell silent, sensing the profound nature of the exchange between the guard and the little girl. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What had started as a tourist attraction had become something much more meaningful, a public acknowledgement of bravery that went far beyond military service. As soon as the ceremony ended, Michael's sergeant approached him. The look on his face was unreadable, and Michael prepared himself for what he assumed would be a serious reprimand. Breaking protocol during the changing of the guard wasn't just a minor infraction. It was the kind of violation that could end a military career. But before any official consequences could be discussed, something unexpected began happening. The tourists who had witnessed the salute started approaching palace staff, asking about the little girl and the guard's gesture. Word spread quickly through the crowd that they had just seen something extraordinary. Within hours, photos and videos of Michael's salute to Lucy were appearing on social media platforms around the world. The images captured not just the moment itself, but the emotion behind it. People could see the genuine compassion in Michael's gesture and the pure joy in Lucy's response. The story began spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. News outlets picked up the story, bloggers wrote about it, and social media users shared it with captions about kindness, courage, and the power of human connection. The hashtag #SaluteForLucy began trending internationally. What made the story so powerful wasn't just the break from protocol, it was what that break represented. Here was a soldier who understood that some things are more important than rules, that sometimes true honor requires making a choice that puts humanity above procedure. The response from the public was overwhelming. Messages began pouring in from around the world, with people sharing their own stories about small acts of kindness that had made a difference in their lives. Veterans wrote about what the salute meant to them. Parents of sick children expressed gratitude for the recognition of their children's bravery. But the most moving responses came from other children facing serious illnesses. Lucy's story had given them a sense that their own courage was being seen and valued. The image of a formal military salute being given to acknowledge a child's bravery resonated with young patients everywhere. Military families also responded powerfully to the story. They understood better than anyone what it meant for a serving soldier to break protocol for such a meaningful reason. The salute wasn't disrespectful to military tradition. It was an affirmation of the values that military service is supposed to represent. As the story continued to spread, Lucy's family was contacted by reporters and well-wishers from around the world. But through it all, Lucy remained focused on one thing: her friendship with Michael and the other guards who had shown her such kindness, the toy soldier that had started. Everything was now accompanied by letters and small gifts from people who had been touched by her story. But Lucy treasured most the memory of that moment when a real soldier had looked directly at her and saluted her courage. Michael found himself at the center of an international conversation about compassion, duty, and the courage to do what's right even when it goes against the rules. He hadn't set out to become famous or to make a statement. He had simply seen a brave little girl who deserved recognition and had acted on his instinct to honor her. The viral moment was becoming much more than just a heartwarming story. It was sparking discussions about what true service means and how the most powerful gestures are often the most personal ones. The world was learning that sometimes the greatest military bearing comes not from perfect protocol, but from the courage to show human compassion when it matters most. The morning after Michael's salute to Lucy went viral, the atmosphere at the palace was tense. Military officials had called an emergency meeting, and Michael found himself sitting across from his commanding officer, unsure of what his future would hold. The weight of his decision was becoming clear as he realized that his moment of compassion might cost him his career. Colonel Harrison, a stern man with 30 years of military experience, looked at Michael with an expression that revealed nothing. The silence in the room stretched on as the colonel reviewed the reports and watched the video of Michael's salute on his computer screen. Each second felt like an hour to Michael, who had spent a sleepless night wondering if he had made the right choice. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you did?" Colonel Harrison finally asked, his voice measured and official. "Breaking protocol during a ceremonial duty isn't just about rules, Thompson. It's about maintaining the dignity and discipline that the Queen's Guard represents." Michael straightened in his chair, prepared to accept whatever consequences awaited him. "Yes, sir. I understand completely. I knew I was breaking protocol when I made the decision to salute. But I also understood that this little girl was showing more courage than most soldiers ever have to display." The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying Michael's face. "You realize this could result in your dismissal from the Guard? That your military career could be over because of this one moment?" Before Michael could respond, there was a knock on the office door. The colonel's aide entered with an urgent expression on his face. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this immediately." The aide handed over a tablet showing news coverage of Michael's story. But this wasn't just local news. International media outlets were covering the story, and the response was unlike anything any of them had expected. The aide scrolled through hundreds of messages that had been sent to the palace overnight. Letters were pouring in from around the world. Veterans from different conflicts were writing to express their support for Michael's action. One letter from a Vietnam War veteran read, "This young soldier understands what honor really means. He didn't dishonor the uniform. He showed what the uniform stands for." Messages from military families were particularly powerful. A mother whose son had died in Afghanistan wrote, "My boy would have been proud to serve alongside someone with this kind of courage." This guard didn't break military tradition. He upheld the best of what military service represents. But perhaps most moving were the letters from children and their families. Kids facing serious illnesses from hospitals around the world had drawn pictures for Michael and Lucy. Parents wrote about how the story had helped their own children feel brave and valued. One letter that particularly stood out came from a children's hospital in Canada. The entire pediatric ward had watched the video together, and the children had decided to start their own courage salute tradition, recognizing each other's bravery in facing their treatments. The colonel scrolled through message after message, his expression gradually changing from stern disapproval to something approaching amazement. Military personnel from different branches and different countries were expressing support for Michael's actions. Even some high-ranking officers had sent messages praising his judgment and character. But the responses weren't uniformly positive. Some traditionalists criticized Michael's breach of protocol, arguing that military discipline couldn't be maintained if soldiers started making individual decisions about when rules should be followed. These critics worried about setting a precedent that could undermine military order. The debate was playing out in military forums, social media platforms, and news programs around the world. Some commentators argued that Michael's action, while well-intentioned, represented a dangerous departure from the discipline that military service requires. However, these critical voices were vastly outnumbered by supporters who saw Michael's salute as an example of moral courage. Military historians pointed out that the greatest military leaders throughout history had been those who knew when compassion should override protocol. As the colonel continued reading, Michael sat quietly, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. He had expected to face consequences for his actions, but he hadn't anticipated becoming the center of an international conversation about military values and human decency. The door opened again, and this time a senior palace official entered with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Colonel, I've just received word from the royal family. They want to make a statement about this situation." Michael's heart sank, assuming that royal disapproval would certainly mean the end of his career. But what came next surprised everyone in the room. The royal family's statement expressed admiration for Michael's compassion and stated that his actions reflected the true spirit of service that the monarchy valued. The statement emphasized that showing kindness to a brave child didn't diminish military tradition. It exemplified the best aspects of what the Royal Guard was meant to represent. The official continued. They want to arrange a private meeting with Guard Thompson and the little girl's family. They believe this story represents something important about British values and want to show their support, Colonel. Harrison closed the tablet and looked at Michael with a completely different expression than he had worn at the beginning of the meeting. "Well, Thompson, it appears that your moment of humanity has touched more people than any of us realized." The colonel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where tourists were already gathering for the day. "You know, I've been in the military for 30 years and I've seen a lot of soldiers follow orders perfectly. But I've seen very few who understood the spirit behind those orders well enough to know when something more important was at stake." He turned back to Michael with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "You're not being disciplined, son. In fact, you're being commended. What you did showed exactly the kind of judgment and character we want in the Queen's Guard." The relief that washed over Michael was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a growing understanding of the responsibility that came with his newfound recognition. His simple act of kindness had become something much larger than he had ever intended. As news of the royal family's support spread, the story took on even greater significance. Michael's salute to Lucy was being held up as an example of how true service means serving not just institutions, but the values that those institutions are meant to protect. The conversation was changing from criticism of broken protocol to celebration of moral courage, and Michael found himself at the center of a movement that was much bigger than anything he could have imagined when he first decided to help a little girl retrieve her toy soldier. The private meeting with the royal family was arranged for the following week, and Michael found himself in the unprecedented position of preparing for an audience that would change everything about how the Queen's Guard operated. But first there was something else that needed to happen, a reunion with Lucy that would prove to be just as meaningful as any royal encounter. Lucy's condition had stabilized somewhat, giving her family hope that she might have more time than doctors initially predicted. When they received the invitation to return to the palace for a special visit, Lucy's excitement was infectious. She spent hours polishing her toy soldier and practicing her salute in her wheelchair. The day of their return visit was different from any other day at Buckingham Palace. Media attention had made this a global story, but palace officials had worked carefully to ensure that Lucy's experience remained personal and meaningful rather than turning into a media circus. Michael was granted permission to break from normal protocol for this special occasion. Instead of remaining at his post in stoic silence, he was allowed to interact directly with Lucy and her family. As they approached, Michael could see that Lucy was wearing a special outfit, a red dress that matched his uniform, complete with a small military-style cap that her mother had found at a toy store. When Lucy saw Michael approaching, her face lit up with a joy that was visible even from a distance. She immediately attempted to salute from her wheelchair. and this time Michael was free to return the gesture properly. The moment when their salutes met was captured by the palace photographer, creating an image that would become one of the most treasured photos in both of their lives. "I knew you were special the first time I saw you," Michael told Lucy as he knelt down beside her wheelchair. "You have the heart of a true soldier." Lucy beamed at these words, then carefully presented Michael with something she had been working on during her hospital stays. It was a hand-drawn picture showing a tall guard in a red uniform standing next to a little girl in a wheelchair. Both figures in the drawing were saluting each other, and above them Lucy had written in careful letters, "Friends forever." The gift moved Michael more than any commendation or recognition ever could. This simple drawing represented something pure and meaningful that went far beyond military protocol or public attention. It was a reminder of why he had chosen to help her in the first place. But the meeting wasn't just about Michael and Lucy. The other guards who had been inspired by Michael's example were also present, and they had their own stories to share. David told Lucy about the young boy who saluted him every morning, and how that boy's mother had sent a letter saying her son now wanted to join the military when he grew up. Robert shared the story of the elderly veteran who visited him twice a week, and how those visits had become the highlight of both their weeks. The old man had even started bringing other veterans with him, creating a small community of former soldiers who found meaning in connecting with the current generation of guards. These stories showed Lucy that the kindness she had experienced wasn't unique to her situation. The guards were learning to see all their visitors as individuals with their own stories and their own reasons for being there. Each tourist represented an opportunity to make someone's day a little brighter. As they talked, palace officials were finalizing arrangements for the formal royal meeting. But what happened next would prove to be just as significant as any official recognition. Word of Lucy's visit had spread among the palace staff, and something extraordinary began happening. Kitchen staff, maintenance workers, administrative personnel, and security officers started finding reasons to pass by the area where Lucy and the guards were meeting. One by one, these staff members began stopping to meet Lucy and thank Michael for reminding them why their work at the palace mattered. A chef brought Lucy a special cookie decorated like a guard's hat. A gardener showed her flowers from the palace gardens and let her pick a small bouquet to take home. The security supervisor, a gruff man who had worked at the palace for 20 years, approached with tears in his eyes. "I've been doing this job for decades," he told Michael, "but I'd forgotten that we're not just protecting buildings and ceremonies. We're protecting the dreams and hopes of people like this little girl." This spontaneous outpouring of affection showed that Michael's act of kindness had affected far more than just the guards. It had reminded the entire palace community that their work served a purpose beyond rules and procedures. It served the people who looked to the monarchy as a symbol of dignity, tradition, and basic human values. Lucy's parents were overwhelmed by the warmth they encountered. Her mother later said that the experience had restored her faith in the goodness of people during one of the most difficult periods of her life. Her father, usually a reserved man, found himself sharing stories about Lucy's courage with palace staff who genuinely wanted to hear them. As the day continued, it became clear that this visit was changing everyone involved. The guards were seeing their roles in a new light. The palace staff were remembering the human element of their service, and Lucy was experiencing what it felt like to be truly celebrated for her bravery. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Lucy asked Michael a question that went straight to the heart of everything that had happened. "Do you think other kids like me are brave too?" she asked, her young voice filled with the wisdom that often comes from facing serious challenges at an early age. Michael knelt down to her level again and spoke with complete sincerity. "Lucy, I think you and kids like you are the bravest people I know. You face things every day that would frighten grown soldiers, and you do it with more grace and courage than most adults could manage." Lucy nodded thoughtfully, then said something that would stay with Michael forever. "Then maybe we should make sure they know that someone sees how brave they are too." With those words, Lucy had articulated what would become the driving force behind everything that followed. The recognition of her courage had meant so much to her that she wanted other children in similar situations to experience the same validation. This conversation would lead to discussions with palace officials, medical charities, and eventually, to the creation of formal programs designed to honor the courage of children facing serious illnesses. But in that moment, it was simply a brave little girl expressing the generous spirit that had made her so special from the very beginning. The royal meeting was still to come, but already this day had accomplished something more important than any official recognition could achieve. It had planted the seeds for a lasting change in how the palace and its guards would interact with the public, especially with those who needed recognition for their own quiet acts of courage. 6 months had passed since Lucy's special visit to the palace, and the changes that began with Michael's simple act of kindness had grown into something that no one could have predicted. The Queen's Guard had quietly implemented new guidelines that allowed for what they called dignified human connection, subtle ways that guards could acknowledge special visitors while maintaining their ceremonial duties. The transformation was remarkable. What had once been a rigid, intimidating experience for many visitors had become something warmer and more meaningful. Guards were trained to recognize moments when a small gesture of acknowledgement could make a significant difference in someone's day without compromising the dignity of their position. Lucy had become an unofficial ambassador for this new approach. Her health had improved dramatically, something her doctors attributed partly to the sense of purpose and joy that had come from her friendship with the guards. She visited the palace regularly now, sometimes in her wheelchair, sometimes walking with the aid of crutches, always carrying her treasured toy soldier. During one of these visits, something special was happening that Lucy didn't know about yet. Palace officials had been working with several children's hospitals to create what they were calling the Courage Recognition Program. Today was the inaugural ceremony, and Lucy was about to meet 20 other children who had been nominated by their medical teams for showing exceptional bravery. When Lucy arrived at the palace that morning, she was surprised to see several other families with children who were clearly dealing with serious medical challenges. Some were in wheelchairs like her, others had visible effects from treatments, and some looked perfectly healthy, but carried the quiet strength that comes from facing invisible battles. Michael and the other guards had prepared something special for this group. Instead of the standard changing of the guard ceremony, they would perform a modified version that included a salute of courage for each of the children present. As the ceremony began, Lucy realized she was witnessing something historic. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about recognizing that courage comes in many forms and deserves to be honored regardless of age or circumstance. One by one, each child was called forward. There was Tommy, age 6, who had undergone multiple surgeries but always greeted his nurses with a smile. There was Maya, 12, who had lost her hair to chemotherapy, but spent her time in the hospital cheering up younger patients. There was Alex, 14, who had learned to walk again after a serious accident and now volunteered to help other kids with similar injuries. Each child received their moment of recognition, and Michael watched as their faces transformed when they realized that their quiet daily courage was being formally acknowledged. Many of them had never thought of themselves as brave. They were simply doing what they had to do to get through each day. But seeing themselves through the eyes of these formal, dignified soldiers helped them understand that their strength was real and worthy of respect. The ceremony was giving them something precious, validation that their struggles mattered and that their perseverance was heroic. Lucy served as a mentor to the newer children, explaining what the guards represented and why their recognition was so meaningful. She had learned to articulate what the experience meant to her, and her words helped the other children understand the significance of what was happening. "They're not just being nice to us," Lucy explained to a shy 8-year-old boy who was overwhelmed by the attention. "They're real soldiers and they understand what it means to be brave. When they salute us, it means they see us as fellow warriors." The impact on the children was immediate and profound. Parents reported that their kids returned home with renewed confidence and determination. Hospital staff noticed that children who had participated in the ceremony approached their treatments with less fear and more dignity. But the program was also changing the guards themselves. Michael found that these special ceremonies had become the most meaningful part of his service. Training to be a Queen's Guard had taught him about discipline, tradition, and duty, but these interactions with brave children had taught him about the deeper purpose behind all those formal requirements. The other guards felt the same transformation. David, who had started acknowledging the boy who saluted him each morning, had been contacted by the child's school. The boy's improved confidence and sense of purpose had made him a leader among his classmates, and the school wanted to understand what had caused such a positive change. Robert's relationship with the elderly veteran had evolved into something beautiful as well. The old man had started bringing his grandson to the palace visits, creating a bridge between generations of military service. The grandson, inspired by both his grandfather's service and the guard's compassion, had decided to pursue a career in military medicine. The ripple effects continued to spread in unexpected ways. Other royal sites around the world began implementing similar programs. Military units in different countries started their own versions of courage recognition ceremonies. The idea that formal military bearing could be combined with human compassion was taking root globally. Medical professionals also embraced the concept. Hospitals began creating their own internal recognition programs, understanding that acknowledging children's courage could be an important part of their healing process. Child psychologists noted that formal recognition of their bravery helped young patients develop better coping mechanisms and stronger self-esteem. Lucy's role in all of this continued to evolve. She had been asked to speak at medical conferences about the patient perspective on courage recognition. Her articulate explanations of how the guard's acknowledgement had affected her gave medical professionals new insights into the emotional needs of their young patients. During one of her talks, Lucy said something that perfectly captured the essence of what had happened. "Before the guard saluted me, I knew I was sick. After they saluted me, I knew I was brave. That made all the difference in how I faced everything that came next." This simple statement became a guiding principle for the expanded program. The goal wasn't to minimize or ignore the reality of serious medical challenges. Instead, it was to ensure that children facing these challenges understood that their daily courage was real, valuable, and worthy of the highest respect. The palace had become a place where military tradition and human compassion reinforced each other rather than competing. The guards maintained their dignity and discipline while also serving as validators of civilian courage. The result was a form of service that was both more meaningful and more authentically honorable than anything they had done before. As the first formal courage recognition ceremony concluded, Michael looked at the group of children who had been honored that day. Each face showed a new understanding of their own strength. They would return to their hospitals, their treatments, and their daily challenges with the knowledge that their courage had been witnessed and saluted by people trained to recognize real bravery. Lucy, now walking confidently with her crutches, approached Michael as the ceremony ended. "Thank you for starting all of this," she said. "But I think this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Michael smiled, realizing that she was absolutely right. What had begun with a toy soldier rolling across wet pavement had become something that would continue growing and touching lives for years to come. 2 years later, Buckingham Palace had become known worldwide not just for its grandeur and history, but for something entirely unexpected: the warmth and humanity of its guardians. The Courage Recognition Program had expanded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, and Michael found himself in the unique position of training a new generation of guards who understood that their greatest strength lay not in their ability to remain unmoved, but in their capacity to recognize and honor courage wherever they found it. Lucy, now 10 years old and in complete remission, had become something of a celebrity in the best possible way. Her story had inspired children's books, documentaries, and countless news articles, but she remained the same thoughtful, brave girl who had first caught Michael's attention. She visited the palace regularly, not as a patient now, but as a healthy child who served as a bridge between the guards and the continuing stream of young visitors who needed their recognition. On this particular autumn morning, Michael was conducting his first official training session for new recruits. The curriculum had evolved significantly from the traditional guard training. While physical discipline, ceremony protocols, and security procedures remained essential, there was now an entire section devoted to what the instructors called compassionate awareness. Being a Queen's Guard, Michael explained to the 12 new recruits standing at attention before him, means understanding that every person who approaches these gates has a story. Your job is not just to look impressive for photographs. Your job is to represent the very best of what service means. Among the new recruits was James Wilson, a young soldier whose own sister had been inspired by Lucy's story during her own battle with leukemia. James had specifically requested assignment to the Queen's Guard after witnessing how the Guard's recognition had helped his sister find strength during her darkest moments. Michael continued his instruction. You'll learn to maintain perfect military bearing while also developing the awareness to recognize when someone needs acknowledgement. A veteran who stands a little straighter when you notice him. A child who finds courage in your subtle nod of respect. A family creating memories that will last a lifetime. The training now included scenarios that would have been unimaginable when Michael first joined the Guard. Recruits learned to identify children dealing with medical challenges, to recognize veterans and active military personnel, and to spot families for whom visiting the palace represented a significant sacrifice or special occasion. But they also learned the crucial balance between compassion and protocol. The goal was never to turn the changing of the Guard into a casual interaction, but to find ways to honor people's courage and respect within the framework of military dignity. Lucy often participated in these training sessions, helping the new Guards understand what their recognition meant from the recipient's perspective. Her presence helped recruits grasp that they weren't just following new protocols, they were participating in something that could genuinely change lives. When Guard Thompson first saluted me, Lucy told the new recruits during one session, it wasn't because he felt sorry for me. It was because he saw that I was fighting hard and wanted me to know that my fight mattered. That's what courage recognition really means. The program had evolved far beyond the palace walls. Military units around the world had implemented their own versions of courage recognition. Hospitals had created formal brave recognition ceremonies. Schools were teaching children to acknowledge each other's different forms of courage. The concept had even influenced civilian life in unexpected ways. Police departments began training officers to recognize and acknowledge positive behavior in challenging communities. Firefighters started taking time to honor civilian courage during emergencies. The idea that formal authority could be used to validate rather than intimidate was spreading throughout society. But perhaps the most meaningful development was happening in the medical community. The original children who had participated in the courage recognition program were now serving as mentors to newly diagnosed patients. They understood both the fear and the strength that came with facing serious medical challenges, and they could share the lesson that courage comes in many forms. Lucy had started a pen pal program that connected children in hospitals around the world. Her correspondents knew her story and found inspiration in her journey from frightened patient to confident advocate. The toy soldier that had started everything was now accompanied by hundreds of letters from children who had learned to see themselves as brave. Michael's role had expanded as well. He was now the official coordinator of the Courage Recognition Program, traveling to other countries to help implement similar initiatives. He spoke at military academies, medical conferences, and educational seminars about the power of acknowledgement and the importance of seeing strength in unexpected places. During one of these speaking engagements, Michael shared an insight that had taken him years to fully understand. We thought military bearing meant being unmovable and unapproachable. But we learned that true military bearing means being strong enough to show compassion, disciplined enough to recognize what matters, and brave enough to break meaningless rules when something more important is at stake. The palace itself had become a different kind of symbol. Tourists still came to see the pageantry and tradition, but they also came hoping to witness moments of human connection. The Guards had learned to create these moments without compromising the dignity of their positions, and visitors left feeling that they had experienced something authentic and meaningful. On quiet days when the crowds were smaller, Michael sometimes thought back to that rainy morning when he first noticed a little girl watching him with unusual respect. He had no way of knowing then that his decision to help her retrieve a toy soldier would lead to a fundamental change in how one of the world's most traditional institutions operated. Lucy, now healthy and thriving, still carried that same toy soldier everywhere she went. But it was no longer just a treasured possession. It had become a symbol of the connection between formal duty and human compassion. When younger children asked her about it, she would tell them the story of how a small act of kindness had grown into something that touched lives around the world. The Queen's Guard still maintained all of their traditional ceremonies and protocols. They still stood with perfect posture and performed their duties with precise military discipline. But they had also learned that the highest form of service comes from understanding that beneath every uniform, there beats a heart capable of recognizing and honoring the courage of others. As Michael ended his training session that autumn morning, he looked at the new recruits and saw the future of military service. These young soldiers understood that strength and compassion weren't opposing forces. They were complementary aspects of true leadership. Remember, he told them as they prepared to begin their first ceremonial duties, you're not just protecting the crown, you're protecting the idea that dignity, respect, and kindness are values worth defending. Every person who approaches these gates is trusting you to represent the very best of what we can be. Lucy, now walking confidently without any assistance, stood nearby listening to these words. Her journey from frightened patient to healthy advocate was complete, but her impact would continue for generations. The toy soldier in her hand caught the morning sunlight, a small reminder that the greatest changes often begin with the smallest gestures of courage and compassion. The story that had begun with a simple salute had become a legacy of understanding that true service means serving not just institutions, but the people who look to those institutions for hope, dignity, and recognition of their own quiet heroism.